The sun was dying over Coyote Ridge, bleeding crimson and gold across the weathered buildings of the frontier town. Dust devils danced between the wooden storefronts, carrying the scent of sage and horse leather through the dry evening air. The red rocks surrounding the settlement glowed like embers against the darkening sky, their jagged silhouettes cutting into the horizon like broken teeth. Margaret Sinclair stepped down from the stagecoach, her traveling dress already coated with a fine layer of desert dust. The driver handed down her trunk with a grunt, eyeing her theatrical cases with the same suspicious look she'd grown accustomed to in every town west of the Mississippi. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost foreign to this harsh landscape. Porcelain skin that the sun hadn't yet claimed, auburn hair pinned beneath a fashionable hat, and green eyes that held both defiance and weariness. "The copper dollar's down that way, miss," the driver said, jerking his thumb toward a two-story building with peeling paint. "That's where you'll be performing, I reckon." Margaret nodded her thanks and lifted her chin as she walked down the main street. Eyes followed her from doorways and windows, cowboys lounging against hitching posts, merchants peering over their spectacles, women in calico dresses whispering behind gloved hands. She'd learned to wear their judgment like armor, though it never stopped cutting quite as deep as they intended. The Copper Dollar Theater was exactly what she'd expected, a converted saloon with a makeshift stage at one end, heavy curtains that had seen better days, and rows of mismatched chairs that would be filled with miners, ranchers, and drifters come showtime. The proprietor, a portly man named Josiah Creed, showed her to the small room behind the stage that would serve as her dressing area. "We ain't had a real actress from back east in near about 2 years," he said, mopping his brow despite the evening cool. "Folk are mighty curious about you, Miss Sinclair. Mighty curious indeed." That night, Margaret transformed herself beneath the flickering oil lamps, rouge on her cheeks, kohl around her eyes, and an emerald dress that caught the light like scales. When she stepped onto the stage, the packed house fell silent. She could smell whiskey and tobacco, sweat and gunpowder, the perfume of the frontier. She began with Shakespeare, her voice rising clear and strong above the restless shuffling of boots. "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks?" The words seemed almost absurd in this place where windows were more likely to be broken by bullets than moonlight. Yet something in her delivery held them spellbound. She moved through sonnets and soliloquies, then lighter fare, songs and comic recitations that drew laughter and whistles of appreciation. It was during her final bow that she noticed him. He sat alone at the back of the room, still as stone while others clapped and hooted. A lone scout. She could tell by his dress, buckskin jacket worn soft with use, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, twin Colts visible at his hips. But it was his stillness that marked him as different from the restless energy of the other men. He watched her with eyes the color of winter sky, sharp and assessing, as if he could see through the grease paint and costume to something beneath. The crowd filtered out slowly, men lingering to catch another glimpse of her, but the scout remained in his chair. Margaret found herself glancing toward him as she gathered the coins and bills that had been tossed onto the stage. When she finally looked up again, he was standing by the door, waiting. "Miss Sinclair." His voice was low, roughened by wind and distance. That was fine speaking. "Thank you, Mr. Wade, Jake Wade." He touched the brim of his hat. "Might I buy you a drink? The hotel dining room stays open late, and it's respectable enough." Margaret hesitated. She'd learned to be cautious of men who waited after shows, but something in his manner, respectful, almost formal, made her nod. "Let me change first. Mr. Wade." 20 minutes later, she sat across from him at a small table in the Empire Hotel's dining room. She'd traded the emerald dress for a simple blue traveling suit, her stage paint replaced with her natural complexion. The room was nearly empty. Just an old Mexican woman dozing in the corner and a traveling salesman bent over his accounts. "You know Shakespeare," she said, stirring sugar into her tea. "Most men out here wouldn't recognize Juliet's balcony scene." A ghost of a smile touched his weathered face. My mother was a school teacher back in Missouri. Made sure I knew my letters before I knew which end of a gun to hold. And now you're a scout. Now I'm a scout." He sipped his coffee, black as midnight. "The Army pays well enough for a man who knows the territory. Indians, outlaws, lost travelers. I find what needs finding." "And what brought you to my show? Mr. Wade, somehow you don't strike me as a man who frequents theaters." He was quiet for a long moment, those winter eyes studying her face. "Haven't heard words spoken like that in 5 years or more. Reminded me of—" He shook his head. "Reminded me there was a world before all this dust and blood." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She'd grown used to flowery compliments and crude propositions. But this was different. This was a man speaking plain truth in a land that often had little use for it. They talked until the hotel staff began extinguishing lamps. He told her about tracking Apache raiders through the Superstition Mountains, about finding water in places where maps showed only death. She found herself sharing more than she intended: the theaters of New York and Philadelphia, the scandal that had driven her west, the loneliness of playing to audiences who saw her as something between an angel and a Jezebel. "It's a hard life for a woman alone out here," he said quietly. "It's a hard life for anyone alone." She replied, meeting his gaze. The air between them shifted, charged with possibility and danger. Margaret felt her heart quicken, aware suddenly of how his hands rested on the table, scarred and capable, yet gentle in their stillness. "I should go," she said, though she made no move to rise. "Early rehearsal tomorrow. I'll walk you back." The streets were empty, save for a few drunks stumbling home and cats hunting in the shadows. The moon hung low and orange, casting everything in sepia tones. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the side door of the Copper Dollar. "I'm riding out at dawn," Jake said. "Army contract to scout the Chiricahua Range. Won't be back this way for months, maybe longer." Margaret felt an unexpected pang of loss. "I see." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small object, a silver compass, its face cracked but true. "This has kept me on course through some dark places. I'd like you to have it." "I can't. Please." He pressed it into her palm, his fingers lingering against hers. "So you don't lose your way." The moment stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Margaret heard herself whisper, as if speaking to the night itself. "A stage actress shared one risky night." The words hung in the air like a confession, a question, a key turning in a lock. Jake's hand tightened on hers. "Margaret, come inside," she said softly. "Just for tonight." Her small room above the theater was sparse, a narrow bed, a washstand, her trunk serving as makeshift furniture. The window looked out over the desert, where coyotes called to each other across the vast darkness. She lit a single candle, its flame dancing in the draft that crept through the thin walls. They came together like travelers finding shelter from a storm, with urgent tenderness and whispered promises that both knew the dawn would break. His hands were gentle despite their roughness, treating her like something precious in this land that broke everything fragile. She traced the scars on his chest, each one a story of survival, a map of all the miles he'd traveled to arrive at this moment. The wind sang through the gaps in the boards, a mournful melody that seemed to understand the bittersweet nature of their union. They spoke in touches rather than words, finding in each other a brief respite from the loneliness that haunted them both. The candle burned low, casting shifting shadows on the wall, counting down the hours until sunrise. As the first pale light touched the eastern mountains, Jake rose and dressed in silence. Margaret watched from the bed, memorizing the shape of him against the growing dawn. He bent to kiss her forehead, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "Will I see you again?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The frontier's vast, but paths have a way of crossing." He touched her cheek. "Keep that compass close." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the stairs, leaving only the scent of leather and sage on her pillow. Margaret clutched the silver compass, its metal warm from his pocket, and watched through the window as a lone figure on horseback disappeared into the rising sun. The town was waking around her, dogs barking, roosters crowing, the eternal cycle of frontier life resuming. She would perform again that night, and the next, playing her roles for audiences who would never know that the greatest performance of her life had just ended. But in her heart, she carried the memory of one risky night, when two lonely souls had found each other in the vast emptiness of the West, if only for a handful of stolen hours beneath the desert stars. Dawn broke cold and unforgiving over Coyote Ridge, painting the desert in shades of ash and copper. Margaret stood at her window, still clutching the silver compass, watching the dust settle where Jake's horse had disappeared beyond the horizon. The town below was stirring to life, merchants opening their shops, freight wagons rumbling down the main street, the endless rhythm of frontier commerce beginning anew. She pressed the compass to her chest and turned away. The show must go on. As they said in the theater, it always did. Days blurred into weeks as Margaret continued her performances at the Copper Dollar. Each night, she transformed herself beneath the footlights, becoming Juliet, Ophelia, or whoever the audience needed her to be. But the magic that had sustained her through years of touring had dimmed. She found herself scanning the back of the room during every show, hoping to see a still figure in buckskin, knowing he wouldn't be there. The frontier audiences were changing too. What had started as curious appreciation was curdling into something darker. Whispers followed her through the streets, about the night a man had been seen leaving her room at dawn, about what kind of woman traveled alone from town to town. The respectable women crossed the street to avoid her, while the men's gazes grew bolder, more presumptuous. "You're drawing good crowds," Josiah Creed told her one evening, counting the night's take. "But there's been talk. Some of the church ladies are saying you're a corrupting influence on the town's moral fiber." Margaret kept her expression neutral as she removed her stage jewelry. "Since when has the frontier concerned itself with moral fiber, Mr. Creed?" "Since it started trying to become civilized, I suppose." He paused, his greedy eyes calculating. "Of course, there are ways to quiet such talk. A woman under a man's protection don't face the same scrutiny." The implication hung heavy in the dusty air. Margaret's hands stilled on her costume. "I'll be moving on soon. Mr. Creed, as I always do." His face darkened. "Pity. A woman like you could do well here, with the right arrangements." That night, Margaret counted her earnings and found them short. When she confronted Creed, he merely shrugged. "Times are hard, Miss Sinclair. Can't pay what I don't have." She knew he was lying, could see it in the new gold watch chain stretching across his vest. But what recourse did a traveling actress have against an established businessman? The law, such as it existed in these frontier towns, was not designed to protect women like her. Margaret left Coyote Ridge on a Tuesday morning, the compass tucked safe in her bodice, her trunks lighter by the costumes she'd had to sell to pay for passage. The stagecoach lurched across the desert, carrying her to the next town, the next theater, the next audience that would judge her before she spoke a single line. Silver Falls was larger than Coyote Ridge, but meaner. The mines had made some men rich and left others desperate, creating a volatile mix that erupted nightly in saloon brawls and street shootings. The theater was attached to a gambling hall, and Margaret had to push through crowds of drunken miners to reach her dressing room. She lasted 3 weeks before tragedy struck. The fire started in the gambling hall, an overturned lamp, someone said later, though others whispered about debts unpaid and warnings unheeded. Margaret woke to screams and the acrid smell of smoke filling her small room above the theater. The staircase was already ablaze, flames licking up the walls like hungry tongues. She grabbed the compass and a single carpet bag, abandoning trunks full of costumes and scripts, years of her life reduced to kindling. The window was her only escape. She climbed onto the roof, her nightgown catching on splintered wood, smoke burning her lungs. Other boarders were doing the same, dark figures silhouetted against the orange sky. "Jump!" someone shouted from below. "We'll catch you!" Margaret looked down at the crowd gathering in the street, some holding blankets, others simply gawking at the spectacle. 20 feet had never seemed so far. The heat at her back grew unbearable, and she could hear the building groaning, preparing to collapse. She jumped. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs despite the hands that tried to break her fall. She lay gasping in the dirt as the theater collapsed behind her, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky like dying stars. Everything she owned except the clothes on her back and the compass in her hand was gone. A woman from the boarding house offered her a blanket and a corner to sleep in that night. By morning, the charity had dried up. The theater owner had fled town, leaving no pay for the performers who'd lost everything. Margaret found herself truly destitute for the first time in her life. She took what work she could find, mending clothes, serving drinks in saloons where the men grabbed at her skirts and made crude jokes about fallen actresses. The compass became her talisman, a reminder that she'd once been worth something to someone, even if only for a single night. The road between towns grew more dangerous as she traveled cheaper routes with rougher company. Outside Tombstone, the wagon she'd hitched a ride on was stopped by masked riders. They took everything of value from the passengers, and when they discovered she had nothing to give, their leader backhanded her across the face. "Worthless theater trash," he spat. "Not even worth robbing." She stumbled into Tombstone with a blackened eye and empty pockets, the taste of blood still metallic in her mouth. The town was wild even by frontier standards. Every other building seemed to be a saloon or gambling den. She found work at the Birdcage Theater, though it was a far cry from the Shakespeare she'd once performed. Here, the girls danced in scandalous costumes while men threw coins and occasionally bullets at the stage. "You're too refined for this place," one of the other girls, Ruby, told her one night as they shared a bottle of cheap whiskey in their cramped quarters. "This life will eat you alive if you let it." Margaret touched the compass through the thin fabric of her bodice. "I've survived this long. Surviving ain't living, honey." Months passed in a blur of rowdy audiences and grabbing hands. Margaret learned to dodge the drunks and flatter the dangerous ones. She hardened herself against the sneers of respectable women and the assumptions of men who thought any woman on stage was for sale. The memories of that night with Jake began to feel like something she'd dreamed, too pure and gentle for the harsh reality of her life. One evening, a fight broke out during the show. Bottles flew, chairs splintered, guns were drawn. Margaret huddled behind the piano as bullets whined overhead, wondering if this was how her story would end. Not in the spotlight's glory, but in a squalid theater, just another casualty of frontier violence. When the shooting stopped and the law finally arrived to cart away the wounded and dead, Margaret found herself staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror. The woman looking back was gaunt, her once bright eyes dulled by exhaustion and disappointment. She hardly recognized herself. But then her fingers found the compass, its silver surface worn smooth by her constant touch. She opened it and watched the needle swing true, pointing north with unwavering certainty. Somewhere out there, Jake Wade was probably sleeping under the same stars, tracking through territories she could only imagine. The memory of his touch, his quiet strength, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious. It hadn't been a dream. It had been real as the compass in her hand. And if that one night had been real, then perhaps she could find her way back to something better than this. Margaret closed the compass and began to pack her few belongings. She would leave Tombstone, leave the Birdcage and its tawdry shows. She would keep moving, keep surviving, keep the faith that somewhere in this vast frontier, paths that had diverged might once again cross. The desert wind howled outside, carrying the scent of creosote and distant rain. Margaret Sinclair, actress, survivor, keeper of one perfect memory, prepared to face another uncertain dawn. The compass pointed north, and so would she. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of alkali dust, depositing Margaret at the edge of Fort Garrison, a town that seemed to exist solely because the desert had forgotten to reclaim it. The settlement sprawled between two mesa walls like a sun-bleached scar. its buildings huddled against the constant assault of wind-driven sand. Even in late afternoon, the heat pressed down like a physical weight, making the air shimmer with false promises of water. Margaret paid the driver with her last coins and surveyed her new surroundings. Fort Garrison was rougher than Tombstone, if such a thing were possible. The recent gold strike in the nearby Tortuga Mountains had drawn every desperate soul within 500 miles, prospectors, gamblers, whores, claim jumpers, and those who preyed on them all. The army fort that gave the town its name sat on a hill overlooking the chaos. Its blue-coated soldiers ventured down only in groups. She found lodging at Ma Henley's boarding house, a ramshackle structure that leaned precariously against its neighbor. The proprietress, a leather-faced woman with suspicious eyes, demanded a week's rent in advance. No men in the rooms, Ma Henley stated flatly. No liquor, no laudanum, no trouble. Break my rules and you're out on the street before you can blink. Margaret nodded, though she had barely enough for 3 days' rent. She'd have to find work quickly. The Golden Chance Saloon was hiring. It wasn't a theater, just a raised platform at one end of a gambling hall where girls danced and sang bawdy songs while men drank themselves into stupors. But it paid, and Margaret had learned to swallow her pride along with the dust of a dozen frontier towns. The owner, Emil Kurtz, looked her up and down like she was horse meat at auction. "You're older than most of my girls," he said bluntly. "But you got class. Some of these miners like that. Reminds them of ladies they knew back east. You can start tonight." The other performers were younger, harder, their faces painted thick to hide bruises and exhaustion. They welcomed Margaret with the wary camaraderie of those who recognized a fellow survivor. She learned their stories in fragments: farm girls fleeing failed harvests, war widows with children to feed, immigrants who'd found the American dream had sharp teeth. "Watch out for Sheriff Claiborne," a girl named Dolores warned her on the second night. "He takes a special interest in the saloon girls, says he's keeping us honest, but what he's keeping is a close eye on who might be worth his trouble." Marcus Claiborne was everything wrong with frontier law. Badge bought with bribes, gun quick to clear leather, morals as flexible as wet rawhide. He held court at the Golden Chance most evenings, playing poker with a rotation of town merchants who knew better than to win too often. His pale eyes tracked the performers with proprietary interest, lingering on Margaret whenever she took the stage. "I hear you're a real actress," he said one night, cornering her as she left the platform. His breath reeked of whiskey and chewing tobacco. "Shakespeare and such, mighty refined for a place like this." "A woman must eat, Sheriff," Margaret replied, trying to edge past him. His hand shot out, gripping her arm. "Indeed she must. Question is, how hungry is she?" The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Margaret jerked free and fled to the dressing room, her heart hammering. She'd dealt with men like Claiborne before, but never one with a badge to hide behind. Days bled into weeks. The desert wind scoured the town constantly, filling every crevice with grit. Margaret performed her numbers mechanically, saving every penny she could, planning her escape to the next town, the next chance at something better. The compass remained her constant companion, hidden beneath her corset during performances, a cool circle of metal against her skin. News traveled slowly in Fort Garrison, filtered through travelers and army dispatches. Apache raids to the south, railroad camps attacked to the east. A gang of Confederate deserters turned bandits terrorizing the territory. The town felt like an island surrounded by violence. Its own brutality turned inward like a scorpion stinging itself. It was a Thursday night when everything changed. The saloon was packed, thick with smoke and the sour smell of spilled beer. Margaret was halfway through a comic song about a traveling salesman when the batwing doors swung open with unusual force. A man stood silhouetted against the darkness outside, and for a moment, Margaret's voice faltered. The set of those shoulders, the way he held his head. Her heart leaped even as her mind insisted it was impossible. But then he stepped into the lamplight, and it wasn't Jake Wade at all. Just another trail-worn drifter seeking whiskey and cards. Margaret finished her song mechanically, cursing herself for the fool hope that had flared and died in the space of a heartbeat. She was gathering her shawl to leave when real trouble started. A miner accused a professional gambler of cheating. Voices raised, chairs scraped back, hands moved toward weapons. Margaret had seen enough saloon brawls to recognize when one was about to turn deadly. "Everyone calm down," Sheriff Claiborne drawled from his table. Though he made no move to stand, he seemed amused by the tension, like a boy watching ants before he kicked over their hill. The miner, drunk on whiskey and righteous anger, wasn't backing down. "This tin horn's been dealing from the bottom all night." The gambler's hand inched toward his vest. "That's a serious accusation. Friend. I ain't your friend. You cheating." The gunshot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space. The miner spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, but he hadn't been the one to draw. A third man, one of the gambler's confederates, stood with smoking pistol. Then all hell broke loose. Tables overturned, glass shattered. Men dove for cover or weapons or both. Margaret found herself pressed against the wall as bodies surged past. Someone crashed into the piano, sending a discordant cascade of notes into the chaos. A stray bullet shattered the mirror behind the bar, raining silver fragments like deadly snow. Through the melee, she saw Claiborne still seated at his table, calmly finishing his drink while men fought and bled around him. His eyes found hers across the room, and he smiled, a cold, calculating expression that promised nothing good. A hand grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the rear exit. It was Dolores, her face white with terror. "Come on. When the shooting stops, Claiborne will be looking for someone to blame." They stumbled into the alley behind the saloon, where other performers huddled in the darkness. Gunfire continued to echo from inside, punctuated by screams and breaking furniture. The night air was cool against Margaret's flushed skin, but she couldn't stop shaking. "This is it," one of the girls whispered. "This is how it ends for us, caught between bullets and badges, with nowhere to run." Margaret clutched the compass through her dress, feeling its familiar weight, somewhere in this vast territory. Jake Wade was sleeping under stars or tracking through canyon country, living a life of purpose and direction. And here she was, cowering in an alley, waiting to see which form of violence would claim her first. The shooting gradually died down, replaced by groans and Sheriff Claiborne's lazy voice restoring his version of order. Margaret knew she couldn't go back inside. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The look in Claiborne's eyes had promised that he'd noticed her, marked her as his next project. She'd seen what happened to girls who caught his special attention. "I'm leaving," she announced quietly. "Tonight, before he comes looking." "Where'll you go?" Dolores asked. "It's all the same out here. Every town's got its Claibornes." Margaret didn't answer because she didn't know. She slipped away from the group and made her way through dark streets to Ma Henley's. Her few possessions fit easily into a carpet bag. The compass, a change of clothes, a handful of coins that wouldn't take her far. At the edge of town, she paused and looked back. Fort Garrison squatted in its valley like a disease, windows glowing yellow with lamplight and vice. The wind carried the sound of continuing revelry from the saloons, as if the violence had been merely another form of entertainment. Margaret turned her back on it and faced the desert. The moon was rising, painting the landscape in shades of bone and shadow. The road stretched ahead, a pale ribbon leading to uncertainty. But uncertainty was better than the certainty of what waited for her in Fort Garrison. She opened the compass, watching the needle swing and settle. North, always north. Like hope itself, constant despite everything trying to throw it off course. With her carpetbag in one hand and courage gathered from depths she didn't know she possessed, Margaret Sinclair began walking. The desert received her like an old acquaintance, vast and unforgiving but honest in its dangers. Behind her, Fort Garrison continued its sordid business, unaware or uncaring that one more soul had chosen the unknown over its particular brand of damnation. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, but Margaret didn't need their approval. She had a compass, a memory of kindness, and the stubborn refusal to let the frontier break what remained of her spirit. It would have to be enough. The storm hit just after midnight, turning the desert into a maelstrom of sand and fury. Margaret huddled in the lee of a boulder, her shawl wrapped tight against the stinging grit, wondering if she'd escaped Fort Garrison only to die alone in the wilderness. Lightning split the sky in violent ribbons, illuminating the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes. When dawn finally came, she was half buried in sand, lips cracked, throat parched. The road had vanished beneath new dunes. She dug out her carpetbag and checked the compass with trembling fingers. Still true, still pointing the way, but north meant nothing without water, without shelter, without hope. She'd walked perhaps a mile when she saw the rider. He emerged from a canyon mouth like a ghost from her fevered dreams, tall in the saddle, moving with the easy grace of someone born to this harsh country. Margaret's heart stopped, started, stopped again. Even at a distance, even through eyes blurred with exhaustion, she knew that silhouette. Jake Wade pulled up his horse 10 feet away, his face a mask of shock beneath the weathered hat. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the desert morning, as if afraid words might shatter whatever miracle had brought them to this moment. "Margaret?" His voice was hoarse, disbelieving. "Good God, is it really you?" She tried to answer, but only managed to croak. Her knees buckled, and suddenly he was there, catching her before she hit the ground, his arms solid and real around her. "Easy now," he murmured, lowering her gently to sit against a rock. He unstoppered his canteen and held it to her lips. Small sips, that's it. The water was warm, alkaline, the most wonderful thing she'd ever tasted. As she drank, she studied his face. 5 years had carved new lines around his eyes, and a fresh scar ran along his jaw. But those winter blue eyes were exactly as she remembered. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked when she could speak again. "The nearest town is 15 miles back." "Running?" she admitted. "From Fort Garrison, from men who—" Her voice broke. His expression darkened. "Claiborne." She looked up sharply. "You know him?" "By reputation. He's been sheriff there for 2 years, though sheriff is a generous term for what he is." Jake helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "Come on, my camp's not far. You need food and rest before we go anywhere." He lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her. Margaret leaned back against his chest, feeling safer than she had in years. The familiar scent of leather and sage enveloped her, bringing back memories so sharp they cut. His camp was tucked into a sheltered canyon, invisible from the main trail. A small fire pit, a lean-to for shade, supplies cached neat and military precise. He helped her down and immediately set about making her comfortable, spreading a blanket in the shade, heating beans and coffee, all with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to solitude. "I've been tracking a gang of claim jumpers," he explained as she ate ravenously. "They hit a mining camp last week, killed 3 men. Trail led toward Fort Garrison, but I lost them in that storm." Margaret set down her tin plate, a chill running through her despite the warming day. "There were strangers in town, hard men. They met with Claiborne several times." Jake's eyes sharpened. "You're sure?" "I notice men who meet with the sheriff. It's a survival skill in places like Fort Garrison." She touched the compass at her throat unconsciously. "I still have this. It's kept me going, through everything." He reached out slowly, as if she might vanish, and brushed his fingers across her cheek. "Margaret, He stopped, jaw tightening. "I looked for you. After my contract ended, I went back to Coyote Ridge, but you were gone, and no one knew where." "I kept moving. It's what actresses do." She laughed bitterly. "Though I haven't been much of an actress lately, more like a saloon girl trying to keep body and soul together while men like Claiborne circle like vultures. Don't." His voice was fierce. "Don't apologize for surviving." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, each lost in thoughts of roads taken and chances missed. Finally, Jake stood and walked to his saddlebags, returning with a worn leather journal. I wrote to you," he said quietly. "Letters I could never send, not knowing where you were." He handed her the journal. "You don't have to read them, but I wanted you to know. You weren't forgotten. Not for a single day." Margaret opened the journal with trembling hands. The pages were filled with his careful script, descriptions of sunsets that reminded him of her hair, of how Shakespeare's words echoed differently in canyon country when he remembered her voice speaking them. Letters full of longing and regret, hope and determination. "Jake." Tears ran freely down her cheeks. "We can't go back to Fort Garrison," he said, suddenly all business. "Not with Claiborne running things, but there's a cavalry outpost 2 days north. You'll be safe there while I—" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "I'm not being tucked away somewhere safe while you ride off again. I've spent 5 years running, hiding, being protected by men who extracted their own price for that protection. I won't do it anymore." He studied her face, seeing the steel that hadn't been there before, forged in the fires of frontier survival. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying if you're going after those claim jumpers, if you're going to face down Claiborne, then I'm going with you." She stood, squaring her shoulders. "I know things about that town, about who comes and goes, who owes who, where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. You need me. It's dangerous. My whole life is dangerous." The words exploded from her. "Every stage I step on, every town I enter, every man who looks at me and sees something to own or destroy. At least with you, the danger has purpose." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, that rare, transformative expression she'd dreamed about through countless lonely nights. "You've changed. I've had to—" "All right." He moved to his gear, pulled out a second gun belt. "Can you shoot?" "Ruby and Tombstone taught me. Said every woman in the territories should know how to punch holes in men who need it." "Smart woman." He showed her how to check the loads, how to wear the belt so it wouldn't catch on her skirts. "We'll approach from the old mine road after dark. If Claiborne is working with the gang, they'll likely meet at the Golden Chance. It's where he conducts all his dirty business." As the afternoon wore on, they planned and prepared. Jake drew maps in the dirt, showing her escape routes and defensive positions. Margaret shared everything she'd observed about the town's routines, guard movements, Claiborne's habits. When evening painted the canyon walls purple and gold, they sat by the small fire, shoulders touching. The intimacy was different now, not the desperate passion of two lonely souls grabbing at happiness, but something deeper, tempered by loss and found again. "I'm sorry," Jake said suddenly, "for leaving that morning, for not trying harder to find you." Margaret took his hand, scarred and calloused, strong and gentle. "We both did what we had to." "The frontier doesn't allow for fairy tale endings." "No," he agreed. "But maybe it allows for second chances." She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. Tomorrow they would ride toward danger, toward men with guns and badges who perverted justice for profit. But tonight, in this hidden canyon with stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky, they had found each other again. "That night in Coyote Ridge," she said softly, "I whispered something. Do you remember?" His arm came around her, pulling her close. A stage actress shared one risky night, and the lone scout found her years later. She finished, against all odds, across all miles, through everything this brutal country threw at us. Maybe that's what the frontier is really about. Jake mused. Not the violence or the gold or the conquest, but the possibility that two people can find each other in all this vastness. Hold on despite the forces trying to tear them apart. Margaret turned in his arms, meeting his eyes. "Then let's hold on. Whatever comes tomorrow, whatever Claiborne and his men might do, let's not lose each other again." He kissed her then, tender and fierce, a promise sealed under the eternal stars. When they finally drew apart, the fire had burned low, and coyotes sang their ancient songs in the distance. Tomorrow would bring violence and reckoning. But tonight, in this small circle of light carved from the darkness, Margaret Sinclair and Jake Wade had created their own frontier, one where second chances bloomed like desert flowers after rain, rare and precious and worth any risk to preserve. The news reached them at dawn, a prospector stumbling into their camp, arrow wounded and half dead from thirst. Jake lowered his rifle when he recognized the man wasn't a threat, and Margaret rushed to help with water and bandages. "Fort Garrison," the man gasped between gulps of water. "The whole town's gone to hell. That gang you're tracking, they rode in 2 nights ago, took over everything. Sheriff Claiborne, he was with them all along." Jake's expression turned grim. "How many?" 15, maybe 20. They're holding folks hostage in the Golden Chance, demanding gold shipments, supplies." The prospector winced as Margaret cleaned his wound. "Anyone tries to leave, they shoot 'em down like dogs. Already killed the banker and the minister?" "The army?" Jake asked. 3 days out, if anyone even got word to them." The man grabbed Jake's arm with desperate strength. "You got to help them, folks. Mister, there's women and children trapped in there." Margaret met Jake's eyes, seeing her own thoughts reflected there. Their plan for a careful reconnaissance was shattered. Time was now their enemy. After the prospector pointed them toward a hidden trail that would bring them to Fort Garrison's outskirts, Jake and Margaret broke camp swiftly. They rode hard through the morning heat, dust devils swirling around their horses' hooves. The landscape seemed more forbidding than ever, red rocks jutting from the earth like broken teeth. Joshua trees twisted into tortured shapes by the desert wind. They dismounted at Widow's Peak, an outcropping that overlooked the town. Jake pulled out his field glasses and studied the scene below. Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders as he surveyed the situation. "It's bad," he said quietly, handing her the glasses. "They've got men on every corner, rifles on the rooftops. The Golden Chance is locked down tight." Through the lenses, Margaret could see bodies in the street, those who'd tried to flee or fight. The town that had seemed so rough and lawless before now looked like a carcass being picked over by vultures. Smoke rose from several buildings where the gang had apparently set fires for sport or intimidation. "There," she said, pointing. "The old mine shaft behind the assay office. It connects to the Golden Chance's cellar. Dolores showed it to me once. Said the girls used it to smuggle out liquor during the temperance raids." Jake studied the route through his glasses. "It's risky. If they've found it, everything's risky now." Margaret lowered the glasses. "But I know that saloon, every board and nail. And I know Claiborne. He's arrogant, thinks he's untouchable. He won't expect anyone to come from below." They spent the afternoon preparing. Jake cleaned and loaded every weapon they had, while Margaret tore her petticoat into strips for bandages, a grim practicality she'd learned in Tombstone. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, they made their way down the treacherous path toward town. The mine shaft was as Margaret remembered, a black mouth in the hillside, partially collapsed but passable. Jake lit a torch, and they entered the darkness. The tunnels smelled of bat droppings and decay. Timbers groaned overhead, and in places they had to crawl through gaps barely wide enough for their bodies. "Used to be silver in these hills," Margaret whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Before it played out and left nothing but empty holes and broken dreams." They emerged in the cellar among barrels of whiskey and sacks of grain. Above, they could hear boots on floorboards, muffled voices, and occasionally a woman's sob or a child's cry. Jake checked his weapons one final time, then looked at Margaret. "Stay behind me. If things go bad—" "Things are already bad," she interrupted. "Let's make them better." They crept up the cellar stairs. Through a crack in the door, Margaret could see into the main saloon. The scene was worse than she'd imagined. Townsfolk were crowded against one wall, men, women, children, all under guard. The gang members lounged around drinking and playing cards, rifles casually pointed at their captives. And there was Claiborne, sitting at his usual table like a king surveying his domain. Beside him sat a man Margaret recognized from wanted posters, Bill Hutchinson, leader of the Claim Jumpers, worth $500 dead or alive. My boys are getting restless. Sheriff, Hutchinson was saying, maybe we should let them have some fun with the women. Might motivate these good citizens to remember where they hid their gold. Claiborne smiled, that cold smile Margaret knew too well. All in good time, Bill, though I've got my eye on one particular dove myself. You there? He pointed at Dolores, who was among the captives. You know where that actress went, don't you? Margaret, the one with the airs and graces. Dolores lifted her chin defiantly. She had more sense than to stick around your stinking town. Claiborne backhanded her casually, sending her sprawling. Several captives moved to help her, but the guns swinging their way stopped them cold. Find her, Claiborne told his men. Check every building. I've got unfinished business with that woman. Jake touched Margaret's shoulder, but she was already moving. The rage that had been simmering for years at every groping hand, every sneer, every man who'd tried to break her, crystallized into cold purpose. Change my mind, she whispered. You stay behind me. Before Jake could stop her, she pushed open the door and walked into the saloon with her head high, every inch the actress making an entrance. Looking for me, Sheriff? Every gun in the room swung toward her. Claiborne's eyes widened, then narrowed with satisfaction. Well, well, the songbird returns to her cage. Let them go, Margaret said clearly. It's me you want. These people have nothing to do with your grudges. Hutchinson laughed. Listen to her, giving orders like she's somebody. What is she, Claiborne, besides a worn-out actress past her prime? She's leverage, Claiborne said, standing slowly. See, Miss Sinclair here has been traveling with someone, haven't you, darling? That scout Jake Wade, the one who's been tracking us across 3 territories. Margaret kept her expression neutral, even as her heart raced. How did he know? Saw you two riding out of Willow Creek last month, Claiborne continued. Moving closer, been keeping tabs ever since. Figured you'd lead him right to us eventually, and here you are. I came alone. Sure you did. Claiborne grabbed her arm, yanking her against him. Wade, he shouted. I know you're here. Show yourself, or I start cutting pieces off your woman. The silence stretched taut. Margaret could feel the captive's fear, the gang's bloodlust, Claiborne's satisfaction at having sprung his trap. She caught Dolores's eye and saw understanding dawn there. Then Jake's voice, calm and carrying. Hutchinson, Bill Hutchinson. You hear me? The gang leader stood, hand moving to his gun. Who's asking? The man who's been tracking you since Cooper's Creek. The one who found what you buried under that cottonwood tree. Evidence that'll hang every one of you. Already delivered to the federal marshal in Tucson. Hutchinson's face went pale. You're lying. Telegraph from the marshal's in my saddlebag. Your man Thomas already confessed, gave up everyone, including Sheriff Claiborne here. They're sending a whole company of cavalry. Should be here by noon tomorrow. The gang members exchanged nervous glances. Margaret felt Claiborne's grip tighten painfully on her arm. He's bluffing. Claiborne snarled. Am I? Jake stepped into view at the top of the stairs, rifle aimed steady. Ask yourself, Bill. Would I walk in here without insurance? Your gold's already gone, evidence delivered, warrants signed. All that's left is whether you die here or hang legal. There's 20 of us and 1 of you, Hutchinson said, but uncertainty colored his voice. 2, Margaret corrected. In the moment when all eyes turned to Jake, she'd pulled the derringer from her boot. She pressed it against Claiborne's ribs. And Sheriff, at this range, even a worn-out actress past her prime can't miss. The saloon erupted. Jake's rifle boomed, taking down the man nearest the captives. Margaret shoved Claiborne away and dove behind the bar as bullets shattered bottles above her head. The captives scattered, some running for exits, others dropping behind overturned tables. Through the chaos, she heard Jake's rifle speaking with deadly precision, each shot finding its mark. Gang members cursed and returned fire, but they were caught between Jake's position and the fleeing civilians. Margaret peered around the bar to see Dolores helping to hustle women and children toward the door. One of Hutchinson's men raised his gun toward them. Margaret didn't think, just aimed and fired. The man spun and fell. "The cavalry ain't coming," Hutchinson roared. "It's a trick. Stand and fight." But doubt had infected his men. Some were already backing toward exits. Others seemed more interested in grabbing what loot they could than maintaining Hutchinson's siege. That's when Margaret saw Claiborne crawling toward her, blood streaming from a scalp wound, his eyes filled with murderous rage. His gun came up just as hers clicked empty. The shot was impossibly loud. Margaret flinched, waiting for the impact, but it was Claiborne who jerked and fell still. Behind him stood old Ma Henley, the boarding house keeper, holding a smoking shotgun. "Never did like that man," she said conversationally, then ducked as more gunfire erupted. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Jake had moved to a new position, catching the gang in a crossfire with some townsmen who'd found their courage and their guns. Margaret reloaded with shaking hands, picking her shots, trying to cover the civilians still fleeing. Finally, Hutchinson made a break for the door. Jake's rifle tracked him, fired, and the outlaw leader pitched forward into the dusty street. Seeing their leader fall, the remaining gang members lost all cohesion. Some surrendered, throwing down their weapons. Others fled into the desert night, where the harsh land would likely finish what bullets hadn't. As suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. Gun smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the moans of the wounded and the crying of children. Margaret emerged from behind the bar on unsteady legs. Searching through the haze for Jake, she found him coming down the stairs, a red stain spreading across his shirt. Their eyes met across the wreckage of the saloon, and she ran to him as he swayed on his feet. "Just a graze," he said, but his face was pale. "Liar," she replied, catching him as his knees buckled. "You beautiful, brave liar." The bullet had torn through Jake's side, leaving a furrow that bled freely but miraculously missed anything vital. Margaret pressed her makeshift bandages against the wound while Dolores ran for the town doctor, if he was still alive. Around them, Fort Garrison survivors moved like ghosts through the wreckage, tending wounded, covering the dead, trying to comprehend how quickly their world had shattered and reformed. "Hold still," Margaret commanded as Jake tried to sit up. "You've lost too much blood." "The gang," he started, "scattered or dead. It's over." She smoothed his hair back from his forehead, her hands leaving red smears. "You did it. That bluff about the cavalry wasn't entirely a bluff." He managed a weak smile. "Sent word to Fort Humphreys 3 days ago. They should be here by tomorrow night." Dr. Silas Holcomb arrived, his medical bag clutched in trembling hands. The elderly physician had hidden in his root cellar during the siege, but his skills remained intact. He examined Jake with professional efficiency while Margaret hovered anxiously. "Needs cleaning and stitching," he pronounced. "Lost blood, but he's tough. Seen worse on men who lived to tell about it." They moved Jake to the doctor's office, a small building that had somehow escaped the gang's destruction. Margaret held his hand as Doc Holcomb worked, feeling Jake's grip tighten with each stitch but never hearing him cry out. His eyes stayed locked on hers, winter blue and steady despite the pain. Night fell over Fort Garrison like a shroud. The surviving townspeople gathered their dead, 8 citizens plus Claiborne and 13 gang members. The rest of Hutchinson's men had vanished into the desert, wounded and leaderless, unlikely to pose further threat. Margaret stayed by Jake's side as he drifted in and out of consciousness. She bathed his face with cool water, changed his bandages, and whispered Shakespeare's sonnets when he grew restless, the same words she'd spoken on the stage that first night in Coyote Ridge, when their paths had first crossed. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments," she recited softly. "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." His eyes opened, focused on her face. "Never altered," he murmured. "Not once in 5 years." Tears blurred her vision. "Rest now. I'll be here. Promise?" "Always." Dawn came pale and tentative, as if the sun itself was wary of what it might illuminate. Margaret emerged from the doctor's office to find the town already working to restore order. Ma Henley had organized the women to prepare food for everyone. Men cleared debris and boarded broken windows. Children, resilient as desert wildflowers, played quietly in the streets their parents had thought they might never see again. "Miss Sinclair?" A young woman approached hesitantly. "I'm Sarah Morrison. My husband ran the general store. We wanted to thank you. What you and Mr. Wade did." "We did what was necessary," Margaret said quietly. "No." Sarah's voice grew firm. "You did what was right, and at terrible risk to yourselves." She pressed a small package into Margaret's hands. "It's not much, but we wanted you to have it." Inside was a simple gold ring, worn smooth with age. "I can't accept this," Margaret protested. "It was my mother's," Sarah said. "She always told me to save it for someone who showed me what real courage looked like. Today, that's you." Throughout the morning, others came. The blacksmith offered to shoe their horses free for life. The owner of the surviving dry goods store brought new clothes to replace their blood-stained ones. Even those who had whispered about the fallen actress now looked at Margaret with respect and gratitude. But it was Dolores who moved her most. The saloon girl appeared with a small leather journal, worn and water-stained. "Found this in Claiborne's office when we were cleaning up," she said. "Thought you should see it." Margaret opened the journal to find page after page in Claiborne's cramped handwriting, notes about her movements, her performances, even sketches of her face. The obsession documented there made her skin crawl. "He'd been tracking you for over a year," Dolores said softly. "Ever since you turned down his protection in Silver Falls. Man like that doesn't forget rejection." Margaret closed the journal with shaking hands. "It's over now, thanks to you, and that man of yours." Dolores smiled sadly. "Some of us are leaving, heading back east or out to California. This town's seen too much blood. But others are staying, trying to build something better. Either way, we won't forget what you did." By afternoon, Jake was well enough to sit up, though Doc Holcomb insisted he remain in bed. Margaret sat beside him, sharing the gifts and gratitude of the townspeople. He listened quietly, his hand never leaving hers. "They're calling us heroes," she said with a wry smile. "The actress and the scout who saved Fort Garrison." "We're not heroes," Jake said. "Just two people who found each other again and refused to let go." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a dust cloud approaching, the promised cavalry, arriving earlier than expected. The town erupted in celebration, children running alongside the mounted soldiers, adults cheering from doorways. The cavalry captain, a crisp young officer named Daniel Brooks, took charge efficiently. He posted guards, began taking statements, and sent riders after the fleeing gang members. When he interviewed Jake and Margaret, his manner was professional but clearly impressed. "Outstanding work, Mr. Wade," he said. "The Army could use more scouts with your skills and judgment." "Appreciate the offer, Captain, but I'm thinking of settling down," Jake replied, his eyes finding Margaret's. Captain Brooks smiled. "Can't say I blame you." He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, your bravery saved lives today. Not many would have walked into that saloon the way you did." "I had my reasons," Margaret said simply. As evening approached, the immediate crisis handled. The captain prepared to make camp outside town, but before leaving the doctor's office, he paused at the door. "There's a reward for Hutchinson and his gang, $5,000, all told. It'll take some paperwork, but it's yours by right." After he left, Jake and Margaret sat in surprised silence. $5,000 was a fortune on the frontier, enough to buy land, build a home, start a new life far from the violence and judgment that had dogged their steps. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked finally. Margaret touched the compass at her throat, then looked at the simple gold ring Sarah Morrison had given her. "I'm thinking about second chances, about roads not taken and finding them again." She met his eyes. "I'm thinking I'm tired of running, tired of being alone, tired of pretending I don't love you." Jake reached up to cup her face, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Marry me," the words hung in the air between them. Simple and perfect, Is that a question or a statement? She asked, voice trembling. Both, either. Whatever gets you to say yes. Yes. The word came out as a laugh and a sob combined. Yes, of course yes. He pulled her down for a kiss that was tender despite his injuries, full of promise and renewed hope. When they parted, both were crying and smiling in equal measure. We should wait until you're healed, Margaret said practically, and decide where we want to go, what we want to do. I don't care about any of that. Jake interrupted. I care about not wasting another day without you as my wife. We've lost too much time already. Doc Holcomb, who'd been pretending not to eavesdrop from the next room, cleared his throat in the doorway. If you're looking for someone to perform a wedding, Reverend Mills survived the siege. I'm sure he'd be honored. Margaret looked at Jake, saw her own certainty reflected in his eyes. Tonight, then? Tonight. Word spread through Fort Garrison like wildfire. By sunset, the small church was packed with townspeople, cavalry soldiers, and anyone else who could squeeze inside. Someone had found wildflowers for a bouquet. Ma Henley had donated a clean white tablecloth that, draped creatively, served as a veil. The cavalry bugler volunteered to play the wedding march on his instrument. Jake stood at the altar supported by Captain Brooks, still pale but determined. When the bugler began to play and Margaret appeared at the church door, his face transformed with a joy that made her heart soar. She walked down the aisle on Doc Holcomb's arm, past faces that had seen her at her lowest and now witnessed her triumph. Dolores and the other saloon girls wept openly. Sarah Morrison held up her children to see. Even grizzled cavalry veterans dabbed at their eyes. Reverend Mills, still bearing bruises from his captivity, performed the ceremony with heartfelt eloquence. When he asked for the rings, Margaret started to say they had none, but Jake produced 2 simple gold bands he'd apparently commissioned from the blacksmith that very afternoon. How did you, she began. I've been carrying hope for 5 years, he said softly. Seemed fitting to make it real. They exchanged vows in voices strong and clear, promises that carried the weight of all they'd endured to reach this moment. When Reverend Mills pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers that could be heard throughout Fort Garrison as Jake kissed his bride, careful of his wounds but thorough nonetheless. Margaret felt the compass press between them, that constant guide that had led them through darkness back to each other. She thought of all the stages she'd graced, all the roles she'd played, and knew that none compared to this truth. She was Margaret Wade now, wife of a good man, survivor of the frontier's worst, and finally, blessedly, home. Dawn broke golden over Fort Garrison, painting the desert in shades of rose and amber. The town that had been a battlefield just days before was slowly returning to life, though the scars remained visible. Bullet holes in walls, dark stains on boardwalks, fresh graves on the hill overlooking the valley. Margaret stood at the window of their room in Ma Henley's boarding house, watching the sunrise while Jake slept. His breathing was steady now, no longer the labored rasp that had frightened her those first nights. Doc Holcomb had removed the stitches yesterday, declaring the wound healing clean. The cavalry had departed, taking the captured gang members to face federal justice. Life was moving forward, but questions lingered like morning mist. Where would they go? What life would they build together? The reward money gave them options most frontier couples never had, but with choice came uncertainty. You're thinking too loud, Jake murmured from the bed. I can hear it from here. She turned, smiling. How does a thought sound? Like my wife pacing in her mind, wearing tracks in possibilities. He shifted carefully, favoring his wounded side. Come here. She settled beside him on the bed, fitting naturally into the curve of his arm. We need to make decisions. Jake, we can't stay in Ma Henley's boarding house forever. Why not? She makes good biscuits. Be serious. He pressed a kiss to her temple. All right, what do you want? Margaret Wade, not what you think we should do, not what's practical or proper. What do you want? The question hung in the air. For so long, her wants had been simple survival, the next meal, the next town, the next stage where she could earn enough to keep running. Now, Faced with actual possibilities, she found herself overwhelmed. "I used to dream about a little house," she said slowly. "Nothing grand, just 4 walls that were mine, windows with real glass, a garden where I could grow things instead of always moving on before they bloomed. Where? That's just it. I don't know. Every town I've been in has had its Claibornes, its violence, its judgment." She touched the compass at her throat. "A habit now. I'm tired of the running, but I don't know how to stop." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Then, there's land north of here, up near Willow Creek. Good water, mountain views. Far enough from town to avoid the riff-raff, but close enough to get supplies. I scouted it once for a rancher who decided it was too isolated." "You're suggesting we homestead?" "I'm suggesting we build something, together, away from saloons and stages and men with badges who abuse them." His hand covered hers. "Unless you'll miss it. The theater, the applause." Margaret considered this honestly. "I'll miss the words, Shakespeare, the poets, the stories. But the rest?" She shook her head. "That life nearly killed me. Jake, I want something real now. Something lasting." A knock at the door interrupted them. Ma Henley's voice called out, "You two decent? There's folks here to see you." They found half the town gathered in the boarding house parlor. Sarah Morrison stepped forward as spokesperson, twisting her hands nervously. "We've been talking," she began, "about what happened, about what you both did for us. And, well..." She glanced back at the others for support. "Fort Garrison needs good people if it's going to be better than it was. We need a sheriff who's actually interested in keeping the peace, not profiting from chaos." Jake's expression was carefully neutral. "I appreciate the offer, but we're not asking you to be Claiborne," interrupted Thomas Garrett, the bank manager. "We're asking you to be what this town needs, someone honest, someone who's proven he'll stand between us and men like Hutchinson's gang. And we want a school," added Mrs. Wilmington, the minister's wife. "A proper school where our children can learn more than just survival. Someone told us you used to be a teacher, Mrs. Wade, before you went on the stage." Margaret blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Dolores," Sarah admitted. "She said you taught some of the saloon girls their letters, helped them read contracts so they wouldn't be cheated. We need someone like that." The offers hung in the air like an unexpected gift. A chance to belong, to build, to be part of something growing instead of dying. Margaret felt Jake's tension and knew he was letting her decide. "We need time to think," she said diplomatically. "This is generous, more than generous, but you've been looking over your shoulders too long to settle easy." Ma Henley finished shrewdly. "Can't say I blame you. Take your time. Offer stands either way." The crowd dispersed slowly, leaving Jake and Margaret alone with the weight of decision. They walked out onto the boarding house porch, looking down the main street of Fort Garrison. In the morning light, it looked almost peaceful, deceptive, perhaps, but trying. "Could you do it?" Margaret asked. "Be a lawman, after all the freedom you've had as a scout? Could you teach children whose parents whispered about you behind saloon doors?" She laughed, surprising herself. "When you put it that way..." She sobered. "We don't have to decide now. We have the money to go anywhere, be anything." "True." Jake leaned against the porch rail, wincing slightly. "But maybe that's why we should stay. Not because we have to, but because we choose to. Because we could make a difference here." Over the next days, as Jake continued healing, they explored both options. They rode out to the land near Willow Creek. Beautiful, isolated, perfect for 2 people wanting to hide from the world. They could build a cabin, run some cattle, live quietly until their bones rested in the desert soil. But they also walked through Fort Garrison with new eyes, saw the children playing with stick dolls and needed a school, saw the fear that still lingered in people's faces and needed consistent law, saw the potential beneath the scars. It was Dolores who inadvertently made their decision. She came to visit on her last day in town, dressed in traveling clothes that made her look younger, more hopeful. "Heading to San Francisco," she announced. "My sister runs a boarding house there. Respectable work for a change. She paused, studying them. You two are trying to decide whether to run or plant roots, aren't you? Is it that obvious? Margaret asked. Only to someone who's made the same choice. Dolores smiled sadly. I'm running because I need to. Too much history here, too much weight. But you two, you changed this place. Maybe it could change you back. That evening, Jake and Margaret sat on the hill overlooking town, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple. The new graves were stark reminders of the price of civilization. But below them, life continued its stubborn dance. I've been running since I left Missouri, Jake said quietly. Scouting was just another kind of running, always moving, never belonging anywhere. And I've been running since New York, Margaret added. Stage to stage, town to town, always leaving before anyone could look too close. Maybe it's time we stopped. She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. The sheriff and the schoolmarm. It sounds like a dime novel. Our whole story sounds like a dime novel, he pointed out. A stage actress shared one risky night, and the lone scout found her years later. Remember? How could I forget? She smiled at the memory. Though I notice we're leaving out the gunfights, the fires, the walking through the desert alone. Details, Jake said airily. The important part is the finding. They were quiet as stars began to pierce the darkening sky. Finally, Margaret spoke. Let's do it. Let's stay. Let's build something worth keeping. Jake turned to face her fully. You're sure? No more stages? No more applause? I'll have an audience of children instead, smaller, probably rowdier, but maybe I can give them words the way your mother gave them to you. She touched his face. And you? No more freedom of the trail. I'll have the freedom of coming home to you every night. That's worth more than all the open country in the world. They sealed the decision with a kiss as the first coyotes began their evening song. Below them, Fort Garrison settled into night, unaware that its future had just been decided by two people who'd learned that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in running or fighting, but in choosing to stay. The next morning, they walked hand in hand to the town council meeting. When they announced their decision, the cheers could be heard clear to the desert. Margaret would start the school in the old Wells Fargo building. Jake would take the sheriff's office, bent on law rather than profit. There would be challenges. There always were on the frontier. People with long memories and sharp tongues. Drifters who'd test the new sheriff's resolve. Children who'd never held books trying to learn their letters. But there would also be rewards. Safety slowly returning. Knowledge blooming in young minds. A community growing stronger because two people decided to stop running. As they walked back to the boarding house to begin planning their new life, Margaret touched the compass one more time. It had guided her through the darkness, kept her oriented when everything else spun chaos. Now it would rest on a mantle in a real home, its job complete. No regrets? Jake asked, reading her gesture. None, Margaret said firmly. The actress is retired. Long live the schoolmarm. And the scout found what he was looking for. Jake pulled her close despite the public street. Everything else is just details. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of the Fort Garrison School, watching her students file out into the afternoon sunshine. 23 children now attended regularly, their ages ranging from 6 to 16. Some walked miles from outlying ranches, arriving before dawn to learn their letters and numbers from the former actress who'd traded grease paint for chalk dust. Goodbye, Mrs. Wade, little Emma Morrison called out. Sarah's daughter, who'd become Margaret's most devoted pupil. See you Monday, Margaret waved, smiling at the girl's enthusiasm. Who would have thought that conjugating verbs could bring her more satisfaction than curtain calls? Yet here she was, finding joy in small victories. Tommy Garrett finally mastering long division. The Hernandez twins discovering they loved poetry. Shy Ruth Holcomb finding her voice through reading aloud. The schoolhouse had been transformed from its Wells Fargo days. Gone were the reinforced windows and iron bars. In their place hung maps and student artwork. pressed wildflowers and handwriting samples. Jake had built bookshelves along one wall, gradually filling them with volumes ordered from back east or donated by traveling merchants. Shakespeare sat beside McGuffey readers, creating a democracy of learning. Another good day? She turned to find Jake leaning against a post, his sheriff's star catching the late afternoon light. He'd grown into the role these past months, bringing law to Fort Garrison without becoming what Claiborne had been. His way was quiet, firm, fair, earning respect through action rather than fear. "The best," she said, stepping into his embrace. "Though I may have caused a scandal." Again. "I taught them the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet. Mrs. Wilmington thinks Shakespeare is too passionate for young minds." Jake chuckled. If she only knew what those young minds get up to behind the livery stable. He grew serious. "Any trouble today?" Margaret knew he wasn't asking about students. 2 weeks ago, a drifter had made ugly comments when she'd walked past the saloon, suggesting that a former actress teaching children was like letting wolves guard sheep. Jake had escorted the man to the town limits with a warning not to return. "No trouble," she assured him. "I think word's gotten out that the sheriff doesn't take kindly to anyone bothering the school marm." "Damn right he doesn't." They walked together toward their house, a modest frame structure on Cottonwood Street, built with their own hands and the help of grateful townspeople. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. Real glass windows, a covered porch where they spent evenings, a small garden where Margaret coaxed vegetables from the desert soil. The compass sat on the mantel above their fireplace, no longer needed for navigation but treasured for memory. Beside it rested other tokens of their new life. A carved apple from a student, Jake's first sheriff's commission, pressed flowers from their garden's first bloom. As Margaret prepared dinner, Jake told her about his day. 2 drunk cowboys sleeping it off in cells. A dispute over water rights settled without bloodshed. Plans for a town bank that would offer fair loans to small ranchers. "Tom Morrison asked if I'd consider staying on permanent," he said, referring to the town council president. "Says I've brought more peace to Fort Garrison in 6 months than they've seen in years." "And?" Margaret set plates on their small table, a luxury after years of eating standing up in theater wings. "And I said I'd have to discuss it with my wife." He caught her hand. "This wasn't supposed to be forever. We could still take that land up by Willow Creek, build something just for us." Margaret considered as they ate. Through their window, she could see children playing in the street, merchants closing shops for the evening, life flowing in patterns of ordinary grace. 6 months ago, this town had been soaked in blood. Now it was becoming something else, still rough, still challenged, but trying. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The freedom, the solitude?" "Sometimes," Jake admitted. "When the council argues for hours about hitching post regulations, or when I have to arrest someone for being stupid rather than evil. But then I come home to you, and none of that matters." "I have a confession," Margaret said. "Sometimes I miss the theater. Not the life, but the moment when the lights came up and the words took flight. That transformation. Do you regret—" "No," she cut him off firmly. "Because I see that same transformation every day now, when Emma finally understood that letters make words and words make stories. Her face lit up brighter than any footlight. When the Hernandez boys realized they could read the contracts their father signs at the grain mill, protecting their family from cheats. That's real magic. Jake, that matters." He reached across the table to take her hand. "So we stay. We stay. Fort Garrison isn't perfect, but it's ours now. We've bled for it, built in it, found each other in it. That has to count for something." That night, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge, neighbors stopped by to chat. Doc Holcomb shared news of a grandchild back east. Sarah Morrison brought cookies from her kitchen, staying to discuss the children's progress. Even Ma Henley grudgingly admitted the town was less hellish these days, when they were alone again. Jake pulled Margaret close. "Remember what I said that night in your dressing room, about paths crossing? You said the frontier was vast, but paths had a way of crossing." She smiled at the memory. You were right. I was hoping more than knowing." He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, that first night, when you whispered about sharing one risky night, did you know somehow that it would lead to this?" She considered the question, thinking back to that young woman in Coyote Ridge, desperate for connection, finding it in the quiet scout who saw her as more than costume and performance. "I think I knew it was important," she said slowly, "that in all the temporary things, the stages, the towns, the applause that died with the lights, that night was real, something to hold on to when everything else washed away. And now I know it was the beginning. A stage actress shared one risky night, and the lone scout found her years later." She turned to face him. "But that's not the end of the story, is it? It's what comes after, the choosing, the building, the staying. That's the real adventure." Jake kissed her then, soft and sure, a promise renewed each day in small acts of courage and commitment. When they parted, the desert wind carried the sound of a guitar from somewhere in town, a Mexican love song that spoke of distances crossed and hearts found. "No more running," Jake said. "No more running," Margaret agreed. "We're home." As they prepared for bed, Margaret paused at her desk where tomorrow's lessons waited. Beside the arithmetic problems and spelling lists sat her worn copy of Shakespeare, margins filled with notes from her performing days. Tomorrow she'd share Sonnet 116 with her older students. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." She'd teach them the words, but more than that, she'd show them through example that love could survive the frontier's trials, that two people could find each other across impossible odds and choose to build rather than burn, that sometimes the greatest role wasn't on a stage, but in the quiet courage of daily life. The oil lamp flickered as she turned it down, casting dancing shadows on the wall. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, answered by another across the valley. The eternal song of the desert, of creatures finding each other in vastness. Margaret slipped into bed beside Jake, feeling his warmth, his steady breathing, the miracle of presence after so much absence. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, students to teach, laws to enforce, a community to nurture. But tonight, in their small house on Cottonwood Street, two souls who'd wandered the wilderness had found their promised land. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient witnesses to human folly and triumph. In Fort Garrison, peace held sway, bought with courage and consecrated by choice. A former actress and a retired scout had written their own ending, one day at a time, proving that in the wild frontier of the heart, love was the ultimate civilization. And in the morning, when the sun painted the mountains gold and children's voices filled the schoolyard, their story would continue, not with the dramatic flourish of theater, but with the steady grace of lives well lived. For Margaret and Jake Wade, that was the finest finale of all, not an ending, but an ever-unfolding beginning, written in chalk dust and silver stars, in garden soil and wedding bands, in the compass that no longer needed to point the way because they had already arrived. Home. Together. Forever. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me on this wild journey through the untamed American frontier. I hope Margaret and Jake's story touched your heart as much as it did mine. Where are you listening to this tale of love and redemption? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know if you're in a bustling city dreaming of simpler times, or perhaps somewhere where the spirit of the Old West still lingers. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West for more authentic frontier love stories, and share your thoughts about Margaret and Jake's journey. Did their reunion move you? What would you have done in their boots? Until we meet again on the dusty trails of storytelling, partners.